Hello, this video is going to show us how to use the Citrix on Azure pricing calculator, as it can look a little bit complex on the first time you see it. We're going to look at the configurable items that you need to modify based upon your own project in order to create a costing estimate, and we will go through a simple example of doing that. Now, the first thing to note is that this generates an estimate of the Azure costs only. Does not include any Citrix costs. So if you're deploying XenApp Essentials, it does not include the $12 per user per month license fee for that. It is just an estimate of the costs associated with the resources that you would deploy into your or your customer's Azure subscription. The second thing to note is that the Citrix pricing calculator is a Citrix product with Citrix's IP. And it is based upon their vast knowledge of workload requirements, application requirements, and best practices, as well as load testing against Azure VMs using login VSI. And some of that data is used in some of the default settings for options within this tool. The final thing to remember is that this site is pulling the pricing data from the Azure Public Web Pricing API. So it will always be up to date, but from a customer's perspective, it will be the worst case scenario, as many customers have enterprise agreements that afford them cheaper rates for Azure services. And we will see at the end how you can go and change this to your own custom pricing. So let's get started. The first thing to do is to go to this URL that you see up here. And once there, enter in your details. I'm going to change this to United Kingdom. Select my postcode and click on access the calculator. Once that's done, I just click on Get Started. And this then will bring us up with our first option. Here we can select whether we want to extend an existing on-premises Citrix deployment into Azure, or whether we want to use the Citrix Cloud. So in this example, we want to use the Citrix Cloud, so I'm going to click on Cloud Service. And this will bring up the cost calculator itself. So just a word about the layout here. On the right-hand side, we have the cost model, or the estimate, which will show you the overall cost based upon the input that you put in on the left-hand side, broken down across compute, networking, and storage, as well as the total cost, and importantly, the cost per user. Now, this section cannot be changed. However, it does update based upon every single change we make on the left-hand side. The only thing that we can change is the currency. So I'm going to change that to the British pound. Now, the left-hand side is where we input the data relative to our specific project. Now, the left-hand side itself is split into two sections. The first is organization profiles, and this is where we enter the data for our project. The second section is deployment profiles. Now, this is the section of Citrix provided information or recommendations based upon their load testing that they've done against Azure VMs using login VSI and their best practices over many years. So let's just have a quick look at deployment profiles. Now, deployment profiles itself is split into two categories. The first being Citrix VDA requirements. Now, this shows the storage requirement and the number of users per Azure VM size, which is listed down here, across two user types, task workers and knowledge workers. Now, all of these numbers can be changed based upon your own specific resource requirements if you know them. But unless you have any absolute knowledge about this, it's best just to keep to the defaults and keep it simple. So I never change any of the values, but you can come along and modify these based upon your own requirements. The second tab, or the second section of deployment profiles, is infrastructure. Now again, this is Citrix's recommendation for VM size and storage per infrastructure component. Now you could come and change these to another VM size, but again, unless you know of a specific reason to do so, it makes sense to keep them as the defaults. So now let's look at the areas that you need to go and enter the data for your project in organizational profiles. Now, the first tab in this section is resource locations. Now, this relates directly to an Azure region, and by default, there are always the same two resource locations entered into here, which is the West Coast offices, which relates to the US West Azure region, and New York offices, which relates to the US East. Now, you can change this region to anything that you want, and you'll see that that's reflected in the costing estimate. However, it does not update the name of this resource location. So for clarity, I always come along and delete these two at the beginning and create my own with a specific name, which we will do in a minute. The second tab is hours. Now again, this seems absolutely fine for me. However, if you wanted to add your own hours profile, click this button, call it what you want and add the hours per week. Or if you just simply wanted to change these two values, you can do that here. The third tab is workloads. Now again, by default, there are two entries in here, task and knowledge, which are the two standard user profiles that Citrix typically uses in any user profiling piece of work. Now, each profile has some expected user requirements in relation to IOPS, bandwidth, and storage that have an influence upon the price. Now, these two default profiles are for XenApp workloads, which isn't obvious. They're not for VDI. To enable VDI or Zen Desktop, you need to enable this Windows 10 VDI button, which will turn this profile into a Zen Desktop profile. But again, it does not change the name. So for clarity, to make it easier as you build out your estimate, I would recommend deleting these profiles and coming back and creating specific profiles that you know that you need. Now, importantly, if you delete this knowledge worker profile, just before you do that, you need to note these values for a reason that we'll see a little bit later. Now, I typically delete these and create 4 new profiles. I create a task and knowledge profile for XenApp and a task and knowledge for Zen Desktop. But again, you can create your own user profiles and as many of those as you want if you have that information, which we will do shortly. And then the final tab is users. Now, this is where you enter your expected user numbers per user profile, which is why if you have multiple, it's good to have deleted the default ones and create new ones with the exact names that you need for clarity. So let's go through creating a costing estimate for an enterprise with 2,000 users. Of those 2,000 users, 1,000 are Zen Desktop and 1,000 are XenApp. Of that 1,000 in each group, 900 are task-based workers, whilst the remaining 100 are knowledge workers. So the first thing to do is go to the Organizational Profiles tab and click on Resource Locations. And then we go and delete these two default profiles by clicking Default Profile. And you'll notice that this costing estimate has been updated back to 0. So we're a good place to start. So I'm going to create one resource location by clicking on this button here. Now I can give it any name, but for clarity, I'm going to call it Dublin because the Azure region I'm selecting is Europe North. Now these options I could change here or I can change them later. So I'm just going to click Save Changes and we'll modify them later. So that's added in the Dublin Azure region and you'll see that the pricing is beginning to build out. Now you'll see on the left-hand side that there's a number of options that we can modify. The first is Smart Scale. So if you know that you want to enable Smart Scale and you know these figures in related to the number of VDAs and hours, then enter those values there. For this example, I'm just going to switch that off. Now this second section is the included components, which can be a little bit confusing. There's 4 components in here. The first is Citrix Cloud Connector. Now this is required because without that, the connection between your Azure subscription and your Citrix Cloud account simply will not work. So we cannot deselect that. But remember that these components are in your Azure subscription. and the following three are optional. So if I wanted, I could include or not include Citrix Storefront, Netscaler, and a DC. So this is relevant because if I chose to use my own storefront in my own Azure subscription, let's just say I wanted more control and the ability to modify it more than what's available from the Citrix Cloud, I would have this as included. And the same applies to the Netscaler. However, I want to keep this simple and I want to use the storefront as a service and Netscaler as a service from the Citrix Cloud, hence why it's included. So I'm going to have this as not included because I'm not deploying those in my Azure subscription. Now, a domain controller or an Active Directory needs to be available for the Citrix Cloud to work. Now, that could be back on premises, in which case I would say it's not included. However, I want to include a domain controller in my Azure subscription to enable quicker authentication. So I'm going to have that on as included. So I've only got the Citrix Cloud Connector and the domain controllers enabled. Now, if I wanted to have HA for the components that are green above, I would just click on this button here to make it true. And basically that just enables an N+1 deployment or configuration for those options. And you start to see that this pricing calculator is building out an estimate. And what you will see if you click on these charts beneath is how those costs above are split out across the components. So you'll see there is a price in there for the Cloud Connector and the domain controller, as well as a network cost associated with the virtual network gateway, which is the cost for the network traffic leaving my Azure subscription back on premises. So that's my resource location or my Azure region created. Now, to build out this estimate, we need to put in some more information. The second tab is hours. Now I'm going to leave those as default. And then the third tab is workloads. So in here, I'm going to add my 4 workload profiles: XenApp Task and Knowledge and Zen Desktop Task and Knowledge. So the first thing to do though is to delete these default profiles. So if I click on delete profile for task and then delete profile for knowledge, that's my default profiles removed. So I'm going to come along in here and click on add workload profile. Now my profile name in this instance is going to be XenApp Task. My workload type is task worker, and I'm going to use these default resource requirements in terms of IOPS, bandwidth, and storage. However, I'm going to change my storage redundancy to local because I don't need to use geographic redundancy for these particular XenApp servers. And because this is XenApp, I'm not going to select the Windows 10 VDI button. So I click on Save Changes, and that adds in my XenApp Task profile. I'm then going to do the same for XenApp Knowledge. So I'm going to give this a name, XenApp Knowledge. If I spell that correctly, XenApp Knowledge. And then my workload type is going to be a knowledge worker. Now note that these values beneath do not change based upon the workload type that I've selected. Hence why you need to note down these values before you delete the default profile. So I know that this is 5 for IOPS, 300 for bandwidth, and 30 for storage. Again, I'm going to change this to local storage redundancy and save changes. So there's my task and knowledge XenApp profiles created. I'm then going to click on add another workload profile for Zen Desktop. So I'm going to call this Zen Desktop Task. Happy with everything there. Change that again to local. But because this is the Windows 10 VDI, I'm going to click on this button to set it to true. And I now have the option of pooled or persistent VDI. Now I'm going to stick with pooled and click on Save Changes, and then add in my last workload profile, which is Zen Desktop Knowledge. Again, change it to Knowledge Worker, but again, change these values because it doesn't do it by default. Again, I'm happy with local redundancy for storage. It is Windows 10 VDI. Ooh. So I need to select that. Just be aware that there's a little bug there that it looks like it's false, but pressing the button makes it false. Pressing the button when it says true makes it true. And I'm happy with pooled. So click on Save Changes. So there we have my 4 user profiles: Zen App Task and Knowledge and Zen Desktop Task and Knowledge. However, the final piece of this puzzle is to add the user numbers based upon my project into those workload profiles and build out an estimate. So we're going to go to the Users tab. And in here, we'll notice that there's no users. So I'm going to go and add a user profile by clicking on the plus user. Now the group field is your Azure region or resource location. So in this instance, I've only got Dublin, but if I had Amsterdam or any other number of Azure regions in here, which I created earlier, they would appear in this drop-down box. So I'm just going to click on Dublin, and the hours is fine, full-time, and Zen App Task is fine. And the VDA size is recommended by Citrix to be the D2V2. So I'm happy with that. And I know that I have 900 of these users. So I add that and click on Save Changes. Now you'll see that the cost estimate now is built out based upon those 900 users, and you can see the values based there. Now, one note here, just in terms of keeping it simple, is that this value is cumulative. So if you add another user profile, this number just gets bigger, and it's not necessarily all that easy to compare the cost of these user profiles as you add multiples of them. So the easiest way to compare, let's say, Zen App Task against Zen Desktop Task is to note that number and then delete this profile and then add another user profile. Again, it's going to be Dublin full-time. However, I'm going to select the Zen Desktop Task to change to that workload profile. And in this instance, the Citrix VDA size for VDI by Citrix is recommended to be the D1V2. Now I can select any VM size I wanted, but I'm going to go for the recommendation in terms of the best price per user on the VM to D1V2. And again, I know that I have 900 users. Click on Save Changes, and you will see this value here is significantly different to the Zen App cost. So it's a much easier way to compare the costs if you're building up your estimate. So I just now need to add in my 3 other workloads to get my overall cost estimate. So I'm going to click on plus user, and I'm going to finish Zen Desktop. So it's going to be Dublin, it's full-time, it's going to be Zen Desktop Knowledge in this case. Again, it's D1V2, and I have 100 of those. Again, you'll see the estimate building out as we've added those additional users. I just now need to add in my Zen App users. So again, Dublin full-time, Zen App Task, D2V2 is the recommendation for Zen App, and I have 900. And finally, I need to add in my knowledge workers. So I come in here, Zen App Knowledge, D2V2, and 100. Click on Save Changes. So I now have my 2,000 users, and the total cost estimate on the right-hand side is this figure. And my per user cost overall is this figure. And again, if I come down to the charge comparisons, I can see how those costs are divided between the infrastructure type, and within the compute column, I can see the individual components and where the costs specifically lie. The largest cost obviously being that Citrix VDA. So the final two items to look at are the Rate Sheet tab, and this is the section where you can add in your custom pricing for the VMs that are included in your estimate based upon your enterprise agreement pricing. So I've currently only got two types of VMs, D1 and D2 V2. Now, and that's, as I said earlier, the standard public pricing. If I had my specific EA customer pricing, I'd come in here and change that to whatever value I wanted, and then that would get updated in your final estimate. And then finally, you can export this this estimate, and once you've done that, it will appear in your saved estimates as long as you've previously logged in and log in when you want to come back and pull out those saved estimates. So that was effectively a whistle-stop tour of the pricing calculator. It is a little bit complex, but hopefully this gets you going. But it's best to play around as much as you can just to see how the tool works in the ways that I've shown, and just see how every component affects the total price at the end. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, my email address is tom.hickling@microsoft.com. Thank you.